Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome back to Bruh Three Houses Takes Bingo, where we go over this bingo chart and check out whether these opinions are valid or not, or if they're pitfalls, or if there's something else altogether, or maybe if it depends on your playstyle. Last time we went over the first 1.5 row, and I plan to do another 1.5 row today, sort of finish the third row, maybe do one more if the video is a little short. So let's get into it. We have Enlightened 1 Byleth first off. Now, there's no verb in this one, it's just Enlightened 1 Byleth, so I think the idea of this take is like Enlightened 1 Byleth is his best class, which I disagree with, but I also don't think that Enlightened 1 Byleth is bad. So the thing about Byleth, I think, for first playthroughs especially, is that if you're new to the game, then tutoring Byleth doesn't seem like a very appealing option to you, because there are so many things you could do in the monastery with your profession points other than tutoring Byleth, and just having Byleth gain a little bit of weapon rank in one thing doesn't seem like a very fruitful use of your experience or of your professor points. Whereas if you are like if you spend it on anything else, like I don't know, giving someone food to get them to Fool, or the church thing where they sing and they gain like faith and like authority experience. There's like countless other things you can do in the monastery. You get the point, right? And in comparison, faculty training seems like a very boring thing to do. So I think a lot of people skip this on the first playthrough, or do like maybe a little bit. But in your first playthrough, you're also not sure what exactly you want to do with Byleth. So in that sense, you might also not have a great idea of where you want him to go, so you do a little bit of everything. And as a result, he can't really qualify for anything good. So almost everyone I see playing Three Houses for the first time on a stream or anything, they just end up using his like default classes of like swords. So he ends up like going like thief or mercenary, and then into like mercenary or myrmidon, and he just kind of ends up in swordmaster. And then he ends up getting his canon promotion to Enlightened 1, and it's just kind of saying like, yeah, that works, and I just keep using it, and it ends up being fine. That's just kind of how you go about it. Funnily enough, my first playthrough, I don't know how I did it, but I went to Wyvern Byleth on my first try. I guess ended up qualifying it, I think, before the end of the time skip, before like part 1, and I was pretty happy with that, because I don't know, obviously the class is really good. We're going to get into that later. I've been teasing it. I actually really want to badly talk about this part, but we're talking about Byleth right now. And that ended up being really good. So I think if you aim Byleth for a good class like Wyvern, that's obviously better than Enlightened 1 if you can get away with it. There's probably other builds for him that work as well. Male Byleth can of course go with War Master, which is also a really good class to attack with. And in the same way, you might think of like, I don't know, there's probably some kind of build for female Byleth that's pretty good as well. Obviously, she can go Pegasus Knight, which is one of the main draws of female Byleth, if you have her. So I think all those options are better often, even if it's like Pegasus Knight versus Enlightened 1, I think there's a fair argument for Pegasus Knight in a lot of maps. But at the same time, I can't fault anyone for using Enlightened Byleth, because it's a pretty fair class. I think it's better than spending points towards trying to qualify for something like Swordmaster. I looked at the comparisons, and Enlightened 1 I think has a reasonable argument against Swordmaster, but whereas Enlightened 1 is like no investment, Swordmaster requires a sword, which even for a unit that uses swords almost 24/7, I feel like especially for new players, I think it's still just like pretty hard to reach. Because Swordmaster needs like B+ swords for a reasonable chance of qualifying for Swordmaster. The modifiers for Enlightened 1 I think are arguably better, but it kind of depends on what you're looking for. Enlightened 1 has extra point of movements. You have 6 move compared to 5, which I think makes a fairly big difference for foot units. So in that sense, I like Enlightened 1 better. Swordmaster gives a 4 speed modifier, whereas Enlightened 1 gives 1. So there's a 3 advantage there. And then Enlightened 1 gives strength +2, whereas Swordmaster gives strength +2 as well, so that's like the same. And everything else, like Enlightened 1 is a bit more balanced, whereas Swordmaster is fast. That's kind of basically what it comes down to. Also, Enlightened 1 has a lot more skill bonuses when you're attacking with them. So like, they both give +3 for swords. But if you use Brawling or Faith or Authority, you'll get more per battle if you're using Enlightened 1. It's a pretty small difference, especially for Faiths. The other thing that makes Enlightened 1 like a little bit less appealing to me is that the spell list of Enlightened 1 isn't very good, or rather Byleth's spell list isn't very good. She gets like Fire, Thunder, which are reasonable early game spells, but not super great if you haven't really done magic before. They're not really holding that well by the time you get to Enlightened 1 in the first place. Bolgan and Ragnarok are like okay, but Ragnarok is a reason that's going to take a long while to get to. And then for Faith, all you got is Heal Nosferatu, the generic stuff. Recovery is like situationally okay, but not super great. And Aura is a Faith, which is not worth going from C to A for. So I just think generally if you're trying to spam magic, it's not very good. That's fine. You can kind of ignore magic for Enlightened 1 though, in my opinion, and just kind of use the swords and like the strength to your advantage, because one thing that Byleth does have, regardless of class, is really good strength, and both Swordmaster and
enlightened one offer swordfare, which is just +5 free damage whenever using swords. That's really good. The mastery for enlightened one is, it's okay. It's like a personal skill kind of. It's sacred power, +3 damage dealt and +3 damage taken for whoever is adjacent to Byleth. Works pretty well with professor experience, I guess. I don't like this power too much because by the time you get it, you're kind of done with putting people adjacent a lot of the time. You're kind of spreading out and killing enemies, depending on what map you're on, of course, and what mode you're playing. If you actually want these kind of aura-like skills in the situation you're in, then obviously you can make use of them. But mastering Enlightened one takes a long time because I think it counts as an advanced class, so it takes as long as mastering like on the warrior class, for example. So not that great, but like situationally useful. Whereas the Swordmaster mastery, for example, is completely ass. It's Astra. It's complete garbage. That's just comparing with the Swordmaster. So I think Enlightened one is like better Swordmaster with no investment, and that's pretty okay. That's fine. It's not excellent, but I think it's better to like go with Enlightened one than invest in something like this or Assassin or something else. So I think it's an okay class, but I wouldn't recommend it if you're trying to look for like the optimal Byleth build. In that case, I would look into something with more offense like War Master, or something with more mobility like Wyvern Rider or the Pegasus tree. Generally, if you're going Pegasus Knight, I'd rather go Wyvern afterwards than go with Falcon Knight, but you know, to each their own. So let me see if I still have my colors available. I'm gonna make this one like yellow because I can't fault anyone for using it, especially in their first playthrough. I think it's fine that way. It's not a pitfall. It's not gonna soft lock you. Okay, that's the right color. Good. But it's not optimal. So like, it's okay. It's an alright class. It works well if you're fine with her being a foot unit that just kind of spams swords with swordfare. Maybe uses some brawling every now and then. The authority boost is kind of nice too. I just wish that tutoring Byleth was like a little bit more appealing in the game. It's actually one of the better options later in the game, being you're like in a monastery with nothing to do, just boosting Byleth because everyone else has probably reached their benchmarks. You have like professor points you can't really do anything with, and then boosting Enlightened one is like nice. And this can be like as early as like chapter 7, or as late as like post time skip, depending on how you go about your monastery activities. Yeah, usually. So I think this one is like okay, not excellent. Dark Knight, we went into it specifically for Annette, but it's on here again as like Dark Knight is not good in any unit. This is more in the context of other units that can go Dark Knight, but often don't, depending on who we're talking about. People like Hubert, I think Lawrence is a really good example of a Dark Knight we should discuss. The thing about Dark Knight that I think new people have trouble with in their playthroughs is that you have these magical focused units, because Dark Knight is really a magical class at the core, right? It's not really, it's not Paladin, it's actually like a magical class. So people who want to go there, like Lawrence, it will start out just needing reason or maybe faith to get where they need to be. So they're just focused on those two and maybe authority. And then all of a sudden for the master class, suddenly you need like writing and lance rank. And you need like, not just a little bit, you need like lance C and then writing A. Like writing A out of nowhere is a huge jump to make if you haven't focused on it before. So I think that alone is enough to just make people give up on Dark Knight altogether when you're first playing. It's like, oh shit, if I want a master class that actually lets me use magic, I gotta go with this. Because I don't think males have any other greater options, if I recall correctly. Like females have memory at the very least, which works. But then for males, it's like Dark Bishop, I guess, if you went there, which is like advanced. So that's not even an option. What's that? What do you even have? You had like, oh, you got like Mortal Savant, which is also considered pretty bad. So there's not much of a choice there, which is one of the main criticisms that Three Houses got fairly early on, and it's still alive today, of course. So it's hard to get into if you're not prepared for it. I do think, though, that if you are going into the game knowing you want to turn someone like Lawrence into a Dark Knight eventually, then it's not that bad of a class to work towards, because I think the horse, it's not, you know, it's not a horse with wings, but it's still pretty good for mobility. Magic units do often have the tendency to fall behind due to low movement and kind of restricted movement too, because they can't just go in enemy range often, especially in maddening. Again, it depends on difficulty, of course, but generally having a horse is better than not having one, especially when you're having some mobility issues and when you're like a somewhat fragile unit that can't always go anywhere. So if you have like a Lawrence with a Dark Knight and the Thyrsus on him, for example, you get huge amounts of ranges to work with. A lot of flexibility. Lawrence also has, of course, the Frozen Lance, if you train his Lance rank, so it kind of synergizes with the qualifications he needs. Lawrence has a riding boom, so I think for him it works pretty well. So I think that alone is like enough to dispel that like Dark Knight is not good in any unit. Like what else is Lawrence going to do? I guess like Dark Bishop would otherwise be his best class to go to. Like you wouldn't go Mortal Savant. I remember my very first playthrough, I actually was like planning on making Lawrence a Cav at first, and I realized he's not doing shit for damage. Then we changed it to Mage, and he just turned out really good.
That was like my first experience with like, oh, maybe this guy should be a magical unit. And then I went over like Dark Knight Annette before, which even if you disagree that it's like her best build compared to Wyvern, or her best like attacking build, I think it's still like agree that it's viable at the very least, like good. And there's not many other people I would make a Dark Knight. I think Hubert is a bit of a difficult case, depending on difficulty and context again, because if you're playing Crimson Flower, which you have to in order to use Hubert, then he doesn't have as much time to get to classes as otherwise, so you really have to like make the most of his tutoring sessions to get him there. I don't think I got him there on my first playthrough of Maddening on Crimson Flower, so I'm a bit turned off by the prospect of like getting a bunch of extra tutoring on him. But at the same time, he doesn't really get much else from tutoring. Like, he can get his authority way up, I guess, to get a better battalion, but he's pretty good with the, I think it's called like the Vestra Sorcery Engineers or something. Basically his personal battalion. I think he like gets a free authority boost if he hasn't gotten to that point yet, if you wanted that. Like, what else is he gonna get? Like, he needs a little bit of faith to be able to use heal, and then he just kind of wants reason, and like I said, maybe authority, but not much utility for that. So you could reasonably invest him in reason, lances, and riding, and potentially get him there. But again, we'll take dedication. If he's there though, again, I think the mobility will come in useful. Hubert has a bunch of useful support spells, like debuffing spells, that you kind of want available. Crimson Flower is kind of heavy on the terrain, where it's like, okay, if like the whole map is on fire, or there's a bunch of sand hindering your horses, that makes the Dark Knight investment feel less, you know, fruitful, especially because those are the maps towards the end of the game. But you can dismount Dark Knight and still get as much mobility as like a footlock mage, if not more. I think dismounted Dark Knight still has like 6, so it's still sort of worth, but it definitely doesn't feel as rewarding compared to having, you know, actual wings. Again, makes me wish you could do Pegasus Knight. Lawrence also has Frozen Lance, of course, or what's this called? Hubert, I think, has Frozen Lance as well, which is pretty good. Let me just make sure that he does that. Hubert, I'm pretty sure he has something to get out of lances at the very least, because I'm pretty sure he does. Yeah, Budding Talent, Frozen Lance. There we go. That's the thing he had. I remember now. Okay, that's pretty nice. So yeah, Dark Knight pretty good on several units, I would say. So let's just get that one a nice little red. I think it's arguably the best class for some units, and then like a viable option for a couple of others. So yeah, Dark Knight is definitely alright on a couple units. Okay, as you can tell, I'm really good at coloring within the lines. Okay, here we go. Next up, we have Mercedes is better than Linhardt. That's what this little sign means. And let me tell you right now, I do not agree with this take, but I've seen it so often. I've also talked about it like several times before on the channel. So I think what you're seeing here is really the difference between people who play 3 houses like they play a lot of other Fire Emblem games, which is just kind of move forward. You move your units in a big block, or maybe spread out a little bit and just kind of take enemy fire and then just fire back at the enemies, and then they need everyone healed because they all took damage. And then that's when Fortify can come in to heal everyone and you know, take care of them, which is okay, I guess. Then you have Linhardt, who is favored by players who are more familiar with the game and don't play that way, but they instead just go into a more offensive approach, and they're looking for other pros instead for units. One of them, of course, being the ability to warp, which we went over last time. Warp is really, really good in 3 houses. That's why warp is overrated. It's colored red. And Mercedes doesn't have warp, and Linhardt does. Another pro that Linhardt has that Mercedes does not is he gets physic a lot earlier. I'm not sure when exactly Mercedes gets physic in other difficulties, but I think in Maddening at the very least, getting Mercedes to physic ASAP, it just takes longer. I think she might get it by 3 or 4, but I think Linhardt can have it by 2 if I'm not mistaken, which is a big difference. It's just extra healing spells, first of all. Even if you don't need the range, just having more charges available of physic is super helpful because you might run out of heals. And the range is also super helpful because it means you won't have to put Linhardt in enemy range potentially to heal someone. Or maybe someone is like completely too far away from Linhardt and it's poor for a move to catch. That's nice. Now, at some point, Mercedes will get physic, of course, and we'll just kind of match that. But it will be a chapter or maybe 2 chapters later, depending on exactly how you go about tutoring. So that's annoying. The other thing about Mercedes, I think, that I'm not super big fan of is her personal skill. Now, I know Linhardt's personal skill is bad too, but people who defend Mercedes often bring up Lift to Serve, or sometimes bring up Lift to Serve. And on Maddening, that's completely bad skill because Mercedes gets one-runed by almost everything, so Lift to Serve doesn't really do anything. But on normal mode, sometimes you can get into cute situations where Mercedes gets hurt, but you can get like Nosferatu or like normal healing in, and it kind of helps keep her alive, so it kind of feels like it does something. I think if she didn't have it, she'd be basically just as good, but it's fair. But I will admit it's better than Linhardt's skill, which is absolutely nothing for him in most game, but people bring up Lift to Serve sometimes. It's like a pro for healers. I think it's a bit confusing because like people who've played
Like Fates, for example, might think that Lift the Surface pretty okay, because in Fates it's actually sort of a decent skill sometimes. But I think in 3 houses it's just not worth it for Mercedes. But again, it depends on the context a bit. But I also don't think you need to play that way in 3 houses that I mentioned before, where you actually want Fortify. I think you're often better off just kind of overwhelming the opponent. Linhardt is of course much better at maps where you just want to kill the boss and get it over with. If he's just not, routing every part 2 map, then Linhardt gets a lot better, because he can contribute through warp. And if you don't need warp, then Mercedes is probably not doing anything either. Like if it's an easy boss kill to the point where like you don't need warp, then Mercedes, like, what's she doing? Like physicking someone after they killed the boss? Like, that's not happening. So I can see a little bit of playstyle, but I don't really see a playstyle where Mercedes is like really better, because I think Fortify in general is just not great, even if you're going through maps a little bit slowly. I don't find it super useful. I remember using Flame in my Blue Lions New Game Plus hardcore playthrough, and Fortify was like okay sometimes, but I remember being really annoyed that the range is so much lower than Physic. It's like half the range that Physic has, I believe, and it's not great. And nowadays, something else that annoys me sometimes about the prospect of using Fortify is the fact that units sometimes need to be a low HP to function to their full potential. Most notably Bernadetta, of course, with Vengeance. You don't want to heal Bernadetta when she's using Vengeance. She doesn't have to be at 0 HP though, or at 1 HP to use it to full extent, so sometimes you can get away with it. But it can create like slightly awkward situations where you want to fortify 2 units but not Bernadetta, so you have to like work around that. But if you're a good player, you can probably do that. But I still think that Mercedes is worse than Linhardt overall. And for my playstyle, the one that I would prefer, I also think Linhardt is the better one. So yeah, Linhardt I think is definitely worse than Linhardt is definitely better than Mercedes. Wow, this is some really ugly coloring right here. I think again, that's the fault of the text formatting. Okay, foul play in the main game. This one I think is really interesting. So foul play is the ability that you get as a Trickster. You need to master the Trickster class and then you get foul play. Now, if you played the DLC, Sin of Shadows, you might really like foul play, and I couldn't blame you because it's the only mobility option you have in that part of the game. You have no stride or warp or smite even, or anything that can really let you move units around beyond moving them manually. So having foul play available is super interesting, especially because Yuri also comes with he comes with like not just foul play, but also with the Feathers of Dromiel, which lets him like swap around. With the not to swap around. He has some cancel. There we go. That's what I'm looking for. So he can move after doing foul play or something else. So it like really just creates a couple of interesting tricks you can do with movements in a part of the game where you don't really have these options to begin with. So it makes foul play look pretty good. But I think it doesn't translate very well to the main game. First of all, because you don't get foul play right away. Instead, what you have to do is I think you have to like certify for Thief, and then you have to promote to Trickster and then master the Trickster class to get it. Whereas in Sin of Shadows, people come with their classes mastered sometimes. So you end up being stuck in a place where you're really working pretty hard towards getting the foul play, because I think Trickster counts as an advanced class, just like an enlightened one, and so mastering it takes like quite a while. And as a result, it's going to take a while for you to get, and it's probably going to be like in combat experience that you have to get. You can't really master it through like the monastery, which is where I think it differs a lot from, for example, getting warp or smite, which you can do through mostly just tutoring and just putting it as someone's goal and they'll get it eventually. Someone like Manuela, for example, just sitting in a monastery and learning faith rank over and over without ever being deployed or ever having to be invested in any way is so much more helpful. Now, if you've heard me talk about warp, you might have heard me say, well, you don't have to choose between warp and foul play. You can stack them both, and you can use them both. But I think foul play adds less to your mobility overall than warp does, and I also think the investment, like I said earlier, for warp is much more reasonable than foul play, and there's not enough reason, I think, to invest in both. I don't think foul play adds much to your ability to move around, and also this foul play, it's also less practical in an environment where you're not trying to one-turn maps, and in an environment where you are, I don't think you need it, if that makes any sense. If you're trying to one-turn maps, then sure, sometimes you might be able to get an extra couple squares out of foul play. It only has a range of 5, regardless of like magic or anything, so it doesn't really get you anywhere like fast, unless you really need those 5 extra tiles. But you probably could have gotten those 5 extra tiles another way too, between all the other options. Same goes for warp, of course. It depends on the situation, but foul play will also like not get you across tough terrain as much as warp does. Like sometimes it will, because the unit you're using is probably getting less terrain penalty than whoever you're moving. But at the same time, if you can't really foul play through a wall. If you're getting a unit through a wall, like a solid wall in a castle of like Embar, that you could have just gotten that unit across the wall to begin with. Like, it doesn't really add anything to moving across the terrain. So in that way, it doesn't really do anything. And when you're playing casually, I think foul play is also less practical. You can't really get someone across the map with a 5-tile range. And if you really need someone to be like across the map, like in an emergency situation, if something's happening across the map unexpectedly, foul play is not going to do a whole lot for you, because you're going to have to sacrifice a turn of someone who's already there to swap with someone who like needs to be in there. So it's really situational. I think for the same reason that, for example, Shove and Smite are more practical skills than Swap is, like the Myrmidon class swap, because you're just switching places, which generally puts one unit in a worse position and one unit in a better position. That tends to be the trend with these kind of abilities, so foul play works less well. So in summary, I think there's more investments than most other mobility options, and it's also the first tile, both for normal play and casual play. For like normal play and what are we calling it, like LTC speedrun kind of tactics. So I don't think foul play is very good. I do think there are like some very minor uses for it, but those minor uses don't really warrant it as for like mastering the Trickster class. I think is too much work for it. I'm gonna get a bigger brush. This takes forever to color in. We're gonna need a bigger bench and a bigger brush. This is better. Yeah, that's a little better. Let's go with this one. All right, here we go. And here's the big one. 3 houses meta is just Wyvern spam. Now, how often have I mentioned Wyvern throughout this video and the last one? I think it must have at least been 20 times. Like, if you take a drink every time I said Wyvern Rider is better, then you're probably just like, you're probably dead right now. You're probably not watching me right now, which is a shame, because you're gonna miss my video. So, right off the bat, Wyvern is really, really good. And for most individual units, whenever you're looking at which one is their best class, Wyvern is probably, if it's not at the top, it's at least top 3. It's gonna be one of their best options for sure. In that sense, 3 houses meta is very Wyvern centralized. However, it also gives very diminishing returns depending on how many Wyverns you already have on your team. And again, that really depends on who else you have on your team, what classes you have planned for them, what difficulty you're playing on, and what you have available as resources for them. Because Wyverns are at their best when they can get maximum resources, but not every Wyvern can get the same resources. And resources can be battalions, which I think is a big one. There are just not enough battalions for all your flying units, depending on what route you're playing. Because like different houses get different battalions, but some of them only get a couple of good Wyvern battalions, and some of them will be very high authority. For example, every route have access to the Sedath battalion, the Keyhole Wyvern company. That's a really good battalion. It gets like a bunch of attack and everything, and really good hit rates as well, as far as I remember. But it's A authority, and by the time you get it from like the Flame Sedath Paralog, you're probably not gonna have the authority to use it. You need like A authority, which maybe Byleth or your House Lord can get that, but that's about it. So you probably won't have the ability to use that. But in the same way, you can have like a lot less flying battalions. So I've played with like 4 or 5 Wyvern Riders before at that point in the game, and I would just like have to go without a battalion for some of them. And that sucks. So either that or just reclass to something else and use a different battalion. Because if you go without a battalion, you lose like not just stat bonuses, but you also just don't train authority and everything. So you don't want to go without a battalion, preferably. And then also, in addition, if you're a bunch of Wyvern dudes, then you lose options that you would have if you had other foot units. Wyvern Lords can be really good if they have their combat just all, if it's perfectly in order. Units that can just like cover their combat with just the Wyvern stats alone. Or units like Byleth, who just has really good stats, for example. It can be Claude, who has all sorts of tricks up his sleeve. Dimitri with the Battalion, Fantasy Battalion, Wrath combo, doesn't need to care about doubling or anything. So basically the House Lords are really good with it as well, because Edelgard obviously has the Amir available and have really good stats too. Units like Ferdinand and Sylvain can use Swift Strikes as a Wyvern, which is also really, really good compared to just running around as like a Brigand. So that's a big improvement for them as well. If you just like going from being a Paladin to being a Wyvern is obviously like a big jump, or even going from Cavalier to Wyvern is a really big jump for them in utility. It gets so much more mobility on all the terrain heavy maps. So units can make really good use of Wyvern if their combat can back it up. But if they don't have, you know, the speed to double or the attack to 2-hit KO or some kind of Battalion Wrath combo like, I don't know, Petra, then they are in a bit of trouble as a Wyvern sometimes if they're on Manding. If you're on like normal or hard, you generally don't encounter these problems, but if you're on like Manding, sometimes a Wyvern is just flying around, not doing a whole lot. Like think like Ferdinand without Swift Strikes or something. They're just not doing enough damage, and they wouldn't necessarily be better off in another class because the Wyvern still has some better stats in the game, but it's not as dominant. And sometimes a Wyvern just needs a little bit more help, and that's where other classes can really come in. There's some classes that just have really, really good combat. Sniper with Hunter's Volley, Grappler with Fierce Iron Fist. Physic is also really important sometimes for Wyverns. I remember playing on hard especially. If you have a Wyvern with no healing available from a distance, then they can sometimes get a little bit worn down, and it's nice to just get their XP back with a quick Physic to the face. The point I'm trying to make here is that supports can be really helpful for a Wyvern, and if you have like 3 or 4 Wyverns already, adding a 5th Wyvern wouldn't add as much as adding just another unit that can Physic them, or dance for them with a Dancer, or using something like Impregnable Wall Retribution. So if you're just saying 3 Houses meta is just Wyvern spam, you're probably wrong, because you need something to make the Wyverns better as well, with support units on the field, and those often have to be foot units. Wyverns don't really have many supportive battalions. Like I said before, I think there's like a strike battalion for flyers, but you only get 1 at most, and it's not even like available unless you use like online features. And then, so to have stride available period, you need someone who's on foot, and without stride, Wyverns move a lot less on the first turn, and maybe later on as well. So Wyvern is pretty helpful to have. It's one of the best classes, period, and individually, for many units, it's the best choice. But if you have like 3 really good units, like 3 really good units that could be Wyverns, if you have like a 4th okay unit, they might be better off in a different class than Wyvern just to help out. And in that way, the 3 Houses meta has a lot more depth in its class system to just spam Wyverns, spam Wyverns, spam Wyverns. Just because for every individual unit the best option is often Wyvern, doesn't mean that the best option for a team is a team of 10 Wyverns, and usually that's what makes it a little bit more interesting than just spam Wyverns. At the same time, Wyverns are really, really strong options, and there is a reason that, for example, the Blue Lions low turn count playthrough is like for the end game, it's literally like 6 Wyvern dots flying around, and they could have balanced that a lot better. But I do disagree that it's just Wyvern spam, and there's a lot of like funny runs out there and funny unit builds you can do that work, but are still just you know, there's some Wyverns involved almost always, but there's always like something else going on as well. Like the class I mentioned earlier, the good combat classes, like the one with like multi-hit skills. And there's also classes that just work well as supports to Wyverns to make sure that they can be used to their maximum potential. So rarely do you just beat the whole game with just one Wyvern. It can happen, of course, by that solo, you know, but it's not always the case. So I made this yellow because obviously the class system is borked. Wyvern is one of the best options. So I still sort of agree with it, but not entirely. Alright, the next one is training more units than max deployments, which is something that I've talked about on Fire Emblem Pitfalls before. It's actually one of the first pitfalls, is just paying attention to deployments in the first place when it comes to deciding how many units you're going to train. Generally in Fire Emblem, I think it's best to have a pretty low amount of units that you train, because the less you train, the less different units you train, the more resources can go to each individual unit. If you have, like, let's say you have a resource value of 100, let's put it in abstract terms. If you're only training 4 units, then they can each get 25. If you're training 8, then they can get like 12.5 each, and that can be a pretty big difference. I'm putting it in like abstract terms, but these are resources like good battalions, like experience, you know, class experience if you're just, you know, not grinding outside of the normal battles that you get. I think I already said tutoring. So basically just everything that you have a limited amount of, you can get more of for each individual unit unless you train. And this goes especially when you go beyond the deployment limit, because in that case, there's going to be units sitting out entire battles. You do have the adjutant system that lets you kind of deploy units, and they can sort of gain some XP. Some things they can get and some things they cannot get. They get less XP, I think, than when fighting normally, but at least they're sharing their XP pool with someone else. So for example, if you have 2 units that one of them is an adjutant, then that adjutant is going to get XP every time that other unit gets XP. So they're not stealing it from anyone else, they're just getting an additional amount. But it's still half XP, so usually they're not going to like level up very fast if they're just being an adjutant. Especially if you're using units beyond that limit, even counting the adjutants. Units that sit out entire battles will not grow very fast and not gain class XP very fast. So it's really going to limit the amount of you know, growth they can get over the course of a couple battles, and that really, I think other level units are just not fun to use in that way, especially if you've had them from the beginning, but they just can't progress through the class system. It makes them feel really bad. So even if it's not like, even if you're not looking to play optimally, I don't think it's a very fun way to play. I'm currently playing Ready Dawn Iron Man, for example, and I'm using more units than I have deployment slots, and it's actually like very painful to have to bench units that I want to train up and get to like the next tier, because I just don't have enough room for all of them. But I want the units that I need, and I also want to train units that, for example, chat wants me to use or my bribers want me to use. So in that sense, I think you're really doing yourself a disservice by training too many units. And it's not necessarily just the deployment limit. I think in general, you just want to maybe consider If you have like 8 deployment slots throughout most of the game, I think you want, for example, to consider training only 6. And then you have 2 free slots that you can use to either slot in units to try them out, have like temporary units that don't need much training, so like Yuritsa in this game, for example. Other games have more of those, but in this game, Yuritsa is like the best example. Have like someone that just strides and does nothing else. Have a unit that maybe just smites or something else, or casts one of these battalions on you. It's not very likely that you have someone who can use them always, but it exists. Try out someone like Gilbert. I don't know, even having an empty slot can sometimes not be the worst thing in the world. It's not optimal ever, but you don't have to pay attention to deployment limits to decide who to train. Generally, I think less is more when playing Fire Emblem. It's kind of brief, but that's really all I can say here, is don't train too many units, and more than max deployment especially feels bad. I really disliked the adjutant system for slotting in the units that I'm actually considering using, because if you're not out there on the field, it doesn't feel like you're using them. Occasionally they'll get like a dual strike or whatever it's called in this game, an adjutant attack, or they'll get like a healing in from healing adjutant, or they get like a guard adjutant. The only one that really feels okay here is the guard adjutant, and even that, it's often the classes that guard adjutant like covers are not really the classes I want units to be anyway if they're actually out on the field, so they sometimes have to be trained especially to be guard adjutants, so it doesn't even feel that great either for them. It doesn't feel like I molded them to be what I want them to be, and that's really what Three Houses should be all about. So generally recommend this is not good advice. Don't train more units. Honestly, just don't train many units. Just don't train many units. Don't train too many. That's really my advice here. I haven't actually ever seen anyone advocate for this, to be honest. I've seen people do it sometimes for fun. I think Zoran on his playthrough on the Golden Deer Maddening, I think he did definitely train more units than he needed to. But Zoran specifically goes out of his way in Three Houses to do interesting things rather than just like turn 1 boss, kill everything. He's actually trying to get like all the side objectives and just doing it because it makes the game more interesting. He's not doing it because he thinks it's like an advisable idea. Last up, I think how much time have I been going? It seems like a pretty good one to round it off on. I think it's been like 30 minutes-ish. Yeah, this should be the last one. All right, we'll do this as the last one. Not using Impregnable Wall or Retribution. Really interesting one that I didn't expect to find here, but it's fair because actually I'm guilty of not doing this myself. So these are 2 supportive battalions that are a bit less straightforward to use than Stride, I find. Partially because they're a little bit more hidden. Like when the game came out, I think we already knew that Stride was in, and so we were like, oh my god, +5 move on every unit that I have in my range. That's insanely broken. Let's use it every single time. And so that's the one that people were like really hyped for. But Impregnable Wall and Retribution were not as publicly known. You also get them later. You get Stride from like one of the first battalion dumps, basically. The first batch of battalions that you are able to get. So that one is just like pretty well known. Retribution and Impregnable Wall you get a lot later. They're still pretty early available, especially if you're playing Blue Lions, but it takes a little bit. I'll go for Retribution first because it's just super brain dead. This Gambit breaks the game in half if you're able to use it properly. It's probably even easier to use in hard than it is on Maddening, because on Maddening enemy phase offense isn't always very good. But even on Maddening it has like great applications because you're giving every unit counterattack. You're making every unit counter every enemy, which is so super busted. It completely flips the whole meta game up its head when it comes to weapons. Like, why would you ever... What's the distinction really between javelins, hand axes, and for example bows, and for example just a normal like silver lance or something? If you use Retribution on a unit, it doesn't matter which one of these you have when it comes to range. They always counterattack, so it completely invalidates every weapon that has as its main pro extra range. And for bows, they already got close counters, so it doesn't affect them too much, I think, at the higher levels. But it completely invalidates like one-to range weapons, in my opinion. Of course, you can't use Retribution on anyone. Use it like, I think you use it twice per battle on 3 units, so it doesn't really apply to everyone you have. But it's still so powerful. It's still so powerful to just be able to go, okay, I can counter everything now. And if you're smart, use it on units that always kill everything that they fight, and so you just get enemy phase killing machines. It only lasts like a couple of turns, but it lasts longer than a lot of other effects in this game. It lasts like 5 turns or something, which is insanely long. And you should probably always use it. It's especially broken on the Blue Lions, because there you get it in like chapter 7 or something, whereas other units have to wait, I think, until time skip or like a little bit later. But the Blue Lions get it like especially early, unlike the Kingdom Archers, which is also a D-rank battalion, so any scrub that you haven't even trained can just cast it on your other units and just make them counter everything. So usually just throw it on like Byleth, Dimitri, and someone else that's really good on enemy phase, and just have them go to town. Felix or something. Super strong battalion, and you're really not, you know, you're doing yourself a disservice if you're not using this ever. Impregnable Wall is a bit more tricky, and I actually don't use it much myself, but I know I should, because On paper, the things you can do with Impregnable Wall are so stupidly strong. What it does is you cast it on I think you cast it on like a fairly interesting group of units, like 6 people or so. And it makes them deal 1 damage, but also take 1 damage from like every enemy combat for an entire turn, like player phase plus enemy phase, and then it wears off. So it gives you almost infinite durability, but it also completely negates your offense. And it can sound like kind of at first. It's like, okay, so like combat is basically negated. Like the combat doesn't really happen, you just use it to bait enemies, which sounds okay, but not great, right? But it's really good bait, it's reliable. Like the people that you're baiting with are never dying. And it's just one of those things that if you're just trying to, like if you're deciding whether to use it or not on the battlefield, it's like, I don't know if I want to use this or not. Usually if you're baiting enemies, you just want to do damage to them. That's the whole point of baiting them. So why? Why would you do this? But there's a ton of like applications that if you're thinking outside of the box a little bit that are like really good. The ones I know about, for example, are baiting really dangerous enemies like the Death Knight without dying. Even if you crit you like twice, it's not going to matter. Just having a unit travel through a group of enemies that you don't necessarily need to kill, but you just want to get through them. Of course, very applicable in Hunting by Daybreak if you're trying to skip that. Impregnable Wall is very good there to just make sure you stay alive even if like 5,000 enemies attack you. Works well with Pass, on for example Claude or Bernadetta to get through there without taking any damage, and you just take out the boss afterwards. I mean, Bernie is not great for Hunting by Daybreak in that sense, but in like another situation, right? You can bait other dangerous bosses. I remember using it on, for example, the Edelgard Paralogue to bait the boss there. So that can be one way to get the boss over to you to kill him easily. It's funny on if you're playing like Gronderfield, for example, Gronderfield 2, and you want to bait Edelgard, but you don't want to get like Raging Storm to death. You can cast Impregnable Wall, and then Edelgard will just deal a bunch of 1 damage Raging Storms to break the Emir in half, which is also a funny use. Not super practical because you could probably kill Edelgard regardless, but it's just super funny to me. If you're having a bunch of units in range of enemies that you want to get them out of, like a bunch of fragile mages, you can cast Impregnable Wall, and they just stay alive no matter what happens. So that can be one way to make it work. Not sure how it affects the AI if they can see Impregnable Wall and if they prefer to like attack other people instead. But basically, it's like it's a big safety net. One thing I realized after last episode, people brought up when I was talking about dodge tank von Ire. Someone brought up like, okay, what I do usually with Ferdinand is I do give him the skills to like be good with swift striking, but I also make him a dodge tank. And so he baits enemies towards me, and then I kill one enemy and I cancel away out of range. And like, okay, you probably could have done that with just using Impregnable Wall instead of Ferdinand von Ire. You could use literally anyone, cast Impregnable Wall on them to bait the enemies. If you're not caring about how much damage I deal in return, then you just Impregnable Wall, bait the enemies, and then just kill one of them with switch strikes and cancel out of range. And then you don't have to invest in, you know, dodge tank von Ire. Like just using like a battalion instead of all the investment for dodge tanking. Seems pretty good to me. So that's like possible applications. Now these are all from ideas from other people. They're not things that I have thought of because I honestly don't use this battalion enough. I find like uses for it sometimes, but it can be a little bit tricky to use. But it generally it can kind of bail you out of tough situations. It does come at the cost of your enemy phase offense sometimes, so you do have to be like very meticulous about how you use it. But when you can put it to work, it's just beautiful. My favorite is still the Edelgard idea of making her just completely break her aim here on enemy phase in Granda 2. But that's more funnies than anything. But yeah, this battalion has great potential. It also has like 5 uses per battle, so if you ever see like a place where it can be useful for a battle, always use it because it's never going to run out of uses. You never find applications for like 5 Impregnable Walls in the entire battle. But obviously you have to be careful. Also something you can do, I guess, is just like very simple to apply. If you're dealing with a bunch of dangerous enemies, you can like hit one of them before you apply Impregnable Wall, kill them, and then apply Impregnable Wall and you're not dying. That's like another one. So yeah, try to find uses for these because they're like super interesting. I mean, Impregnable Wall is interesting. Retribution is just broken. Always use Retribution. It's super good. You probably don't need more than 1 per battle, like more than 1 unit carrying the battalions that have these. But just having 1 around is almost always useful. You should also use Blessing if you haven't been already. It's also very good, but that one is like more. It goes without saying that one's good. So yeah, there we go. There's part 2. Couple mild ones, couple mild disagreements, or mild like whatever, but mostly disagreements so far. So right now I haven't gotten any green yet. I haven't been able to use my green colors yet. Maybe next time I'll actually agree with one of these takes, but for now this is what I got. Let me know in the comments what you agree or disagree with. Let me know if you got bingo already, and I will see you next time. Peace around and goodbye.